are here today. I'm really excited because I get to continue our walk through the book, or as we now know, a letter, of Ephesians, which is really fun, and I think it'll be really cool. We are currently on week 4 of Ephesians, and if you haven't caught on yet, there is a theme that is there throughout the whole letter of Ephesians. And if you haven't been here or if you haven't noticed it yet, that theme is unity. Now, this is a really big and really important topic for us to discuss as a church, and it is so important. This is funny for me that not just unity is a really important discussion, but Ephesians too. When I was a student, growing up, we had a student leader who was teaching for us, and he was teaching during the Ephesians series that we had, and he was wrapping up this Ephesians series for us. And as he's talking about how important all of this is, he takes his physical Bible that he was teaching out of, and he grabs the book of Ephesians, and he says, if you guys don't read anything in the Bible, please read Ephesians. It is this important. And he rips the book of Ephesians out of his Bible and is waving it and stuff, which was wild and memorable for me as a student. I'm not going to be doing that today. I do think the whole Bible is very important, and I would love if you guys read the whole Bible, but I do think that Ephesians is also important, and the theme of unity that is found within it is also just as important for us to discuss. And just to remind us, back in chapter 1 of Ephesians, Shelley talked about this. In verses 7 through 10, Paul says this: "In him, in Jesus, we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses, according to the riches of his grace, which he lavished upon us in all wisdom and insight, making known to us the mystery of his will, according to his purpose, which he set forth in Christ as a plan for the fullness of time to unite all things and things on earth." God revealed a plan, a mystery that he had had for a very, very long time through Jesus' death and resurrection and the ministry, the life that he led. And that is this concept of unity. And this is such a big topic that we're going to be diving into this throughout today. But we are in the point of Ephesians where Paul takes all of the information he's been giving us. So far, he's kind of been reminding us of some of Jesus' life, some of his teachings, things like that. He shifts into a challenge in this last half of Ephesians. And so that's where we're going to pick up today in Ephesians 4. We're just going to dive in and start reading this. This is Ephesians 4, verses 1 through 3. Paul challenges us by saying this: "I, therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and greatness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace." Now, there's a lot to pick up here just in the first 3 verses of this challenge. And first, did you notice how Paul continued his theme? He's again reminding us, we've been talking about this for 3 chapters now, this is still a part of the challenge, unity. But he didn't just point that out. You may have noticed that I bolded a couple of those words, calling and called. Now, when Paul uses these words, I think that he is actually linking us towards something. He's trying to help us connect some dots. But what's weird about this is to connect these dots, we have to understand the Greek text, Because some of these words, they change over time. You guys understand how language works, and we lose maybe a bit of these connections when we translate it to English because we have different words for different things. And so we're going to, again, this week, I know we've looked at the Greek a couple of times in this series, but we're going to, again, dive back into this because I think it is important enough. There are two words here, calling and called. And in the Greek, these words are klesis and kaleo. These are the two words in Greek. They mean what you would expect these to mean. Klesis is the noun version of kaleo, and kaleo just means to call. And so both of these are pretty much one-for-ones with what their English counterpart is. They're used pretty much the same way in the Greek as they are in English, but Paul's using these words to help us connect to something else, another word that doesn't have the same thing, connection bit, as it does in English. And that word is church. Now, we're going to get even a little bit more nerdy than we already are today, because we're going to look at the etymology of church. That just means the study of how words came to be what they are, right? And if you Google the etymology of church, you're probably going to find stuff like it comes from the word Kirche, or words like that, which is the German word for church, or Kirche, or things. They're very similar, and then you continue to trace that back, and you get to a Greek word, which will also be on the screen, which is kuriakon. And this word comes from the Greek word kurios. And kurios is a Greek word for Lord. Every time that you read in the New Testament, when it's talking about Jesus being Lord or God being the Lord or our Lord or anything like that, they're using the word kurios. And kuriakon just means of the Lord. And so eventually, church started being referenced, this group of believers who would follow Jesus started being referenced as of the Lord, kuriakon. And eventually that word gets shortened, it gets morphed as words do, until we get to something like church. Now, all of that's cool, and it makes a little bit of sense, but you're going to be really confused then if you go to the Bible and start reading in the Greek New Testament, and you get to something like Matthew 16:18, where Jesus says this to Peter, "And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my ecclesia." That's not the same word. That's a different word. Ecclesia, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. See, in the New Testament, they don't use kuriakon to describe church. They use the word ecclesia. This is a different word. Kuriakon came about just because that was what was popular to describe people who followed God. That's just kind of how words work sometimes. But when they were writing about the church, about God's body of people, they used the word ecclesia. And this is a really cool word in Greek. It's broken up into two parts here. It's an amalgamation of two words. You've got ek, which just means out of, and then you've got klesia. And if you're kind of sharp-eyed, you might notice that klesia looks a lot like klesis and kaleo. And that's because it's the same word. It's just ending different. It has a different ending on it, which you also might be familiar with if you're familiar with other languages. And so basically what this word meant, it was used in Greek culture. They actually used this to usually mean like an assembly or a group or something. If you're a history buff, you might know of the Ecclesia of Athens, which was essentially like a ruling body of citizens that would make decisions for stuff and whatnot. But it's cool that this word that they are using for church means the ones who are called out of. Because if we are called out of something, that means that we're called into something too, right? And I think that's what Paul is trying to get us to see here as he uses the same words. He says, if we are ecclesia, if we are called out of something, this is what our calling is. you have been called to do blank. And that's where Paul continues. That's where he picks up. And we're going to pick up there in Ephesians 4, verses 4 through 6. Paul says this: "There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope that belongs to your call. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all." Now that's a lot of ones, right? Again, Paul is reiterating the theme of unity. And he is saying our calling, what we have been called into, is to be unified into one body, one faith. And if you're familiar with Paul's writing, this image of God's church, God's kingdom being one body, is something he uses quite often, right? And I do think that it is a beautiful image that communicates a lot on how God's kingdom is meant to work. But I do think sometimes it is a little bit confusing for us to fully grasp everything that Paul is trying to say with that imagery. And so I am curious, how many of you in this room have been rock climbing before? How many of you have been rock climbing? A good amount of hands. I'm glad some of you have been. It is very fun if you have never been. I've always loved rock climbing. In fact, I've got a picture of young Curtis rock climbing. That is at Torrent Falls in Kentucky. And it's like this big rock horseshoe thing where a waterfall carved out a chunk of it, and you climb up and sideways throughout this whole horseshoe thing. And I've loved rock climbing for a long time, but unfortunately we do live in Ohio, and we don't have a lot of mountains. And so most of the rock climbing that I get to do now is indoor gym rock climbing, which is still fun. It's not necessarily the same, but it is still fun. And for those of you who don't know about rock climbing, I do have some gear to show you just so that you can be familiar with what you might need. So first, this is a bag of chalk. You put this on your hands. This is to help you get a little bit more traction, helps keeps your hands dry. Have you ever watched a video, like a YouTube short or something, of somebody doing something really scary, really high, skydiving, they're on a ledge or something, and then your hands start to get clammy just watching it on your phone? Our bodies do that too while you're doing that thing, and so sometimes you need something to help keep your hands dry and focused. Very important stuff. I've also got here some rock climbing shoes. If you didn't know, you use specific shoes to rock climb. These have a specific type of rubber that's really grippy. Helps you get solid traction on a rock wall. They also are really tight and kind of point your feet into one point, which will hopefully let you get holds on really small surfaces as you are rock climbing. We've got some finger tape here. You can use this for a lot of different things, but I usually use it for covering blisters or stuff like that to kind of help protect my fingers a little bit. There's also a gross thing called flappers where you can rip your finger or something on a rock wall, and then you've got a flap of skin that you can then tie down with some of the tape. I've also got, all of you should hopefully know what these are, but this is some nail clippers, and this is also important. If you have never climbed, I know a lot of you haven't climbed, but just imagine trying to climb a rock wall with long fingers as your fingernail. Think of fingernails on a chalkboard, just on a much more coarse surface that is hard and uncomfortable. It's not a good time, and so it's pretty important to make sure your nails are trimmed and things like that. Not pictured here, you also have stuff like harnesses, a belay device, rope. All of those things are also obviously very important for rock climbing. But I'm curious, and online campus, feel free to answer this question too, but does anybody want to take a stab at what you think, which piece of gear do you think is the least important? when it comes to rock climbing, of the things that I have pictured here? Which one do you think, you can shout it out, might be the least important? Finger tape, nail clippers, those are good guesses. The shoes, also fair, good guesses. The shoes. So if I were to pick one that I thought was probably the least important, I would probably go with the fingernail clippers, because even though it is uncomfortable to climb with long nails, the rock wall will clip your nails for you too. So it's probably fine. But even then, as a climber, I think all of these things are important. And if I don't have one of these things, I'm probably going to skip my day at the rock wall gym and just come back a different day because I don't want to not have these items. The fingernail clippers are important for my comfort so that I can have a good time on the wall. The chalk is important so that my hands stay dry, so that they stay a little bit more protected. I can get more traction on the wall. The shoes even are just as important. Even though you can climb with tennis shoes, or in some cases even no shoes, it's harder. It slows you down, you'll slip more, you're not going to be able to take the same routes that you might be able to take with climbing shoes because your feet won't be able to hold certain holds, right? And I think that this is what Paul is trying to say here when he is saying that we are called to be one body. Because all of you know we have different passions, we have different talents, we have different gifts from God's Spirit. We understand those things. But sometimes it's really easy to convince ourselves that some talents are better than others, that some passions are more noble than others, that some gifts from the Spirit are more important than others. And that is not the case. And that is what Paul is trying to convince us of by using this argument of God's church being one body. That, yes, sure, I could go climbing without my rock climbing shoes, but I'm going to be a worse climber if I do that. I'm going to slip more. It's going to take me twice as long. I'm not going to be able to take the route that I might want to take. And similarly, when we are missing even one of us, when we are missing you, when we're missing your neighbor, your coworker, even the person that you do not like, when we are missing that, we are not as effective of a body, because all of us are just as important. And that is this first nugget of what Paul is trying to convince us of with unity, is that God's plan for us, as Paul says in chapter 1, is for all of us, everybody, heaven and earth, to be unified under Jesus. So if we're missing the people around us, then that image isn't complete yet, right? And that's already pretty powerful, but Paul has a really beautiful image that he follows this up with in Ephesians 5 to help us understand a different side of this calling of unity. In Ephesians 5:22 through 31, Paul says this: "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives, as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Now, if you're a bit like me, you might feel a little bit uncomfortable reading that, because it might feel like Paul is trying to say that women shouldn't have a voice in a relationship, or that only the man can make decisions. But we have to remember two things as we're reading this. First, Jesus' message, the one that Paul is trying to communicate to us, is very subversive for the culture that it was inside of. And second, Paul is trying to teach us something about unity and how that concept applies to us as a church body, something about this calling to live as one. See, at the time, it was expected for women to behave the way that Paul was describing in this passage. That was the expectation. That's already what would have been happening. That would have sounded completely normal to them. But what wasn't normal, what wasn't expected, was for the husbands to do the same thing in return. And in this passage, Paul isn't challenging the women here. Paul is challenging the men. Paul is saying, husbands, your wives are already loving you. They are doing what they should be. You, in return, need to give them that same thing, because God's idea of what marriage, of what a relationship is that you are two people become one entity. And so for husbands, you need to be willing to sacrifice anything for your wife. Because when you do that, when you show that kind of love to that person, you are loving yourself. Because you are one thing. And so Paul is trying to get us to see this challenge that is represented and exampled beautifully in what a healthy relationship looks like. Because a healthy relationship is where both people are willing to sacrifice everything for the other person, because they know that when they do that, they are doing it for themselves too. That is what healthy relationship looks like. And that is what Paul is trying to get us to see with what we need to do for unity as one body, one ecclesia. Paul continues this idea in verses 32 and 33, saying this mysterion, we'll come back to that, is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. If any of you remember that word mysterion from when Greg taught last week, it means mystery, right? A hidden truth that is now revealed to us. And Paul is saying here that some of the mystery of how a marriage works is applicable to what Jesus is calling us into as a community. If you ask any married couple, they will probably tell you that it is not easy, but hopefully in the same breath, they will tell you that it is exceedingly beautiful. That being able to give up what you want for somebody else and having somebody else do the same for you consistently is something amazing and different. And that is what Paul is trying to convince us that we are being called into. If we are the church, then we are ecclesia, a group that has been called out of something. If we have been called out of something, then we have been called in to something different. And Paul challenges us in chapters 4 and 5 that we are called into a thing that is extremely difficult but exceedingly beautiful. This idea of being willing to sacrifice for anyone around you. And it is hard. It is hard to do it when you love the person. It's even harder to do it to the people that you barely know or that you don't like. But that is the challenge. That is what we are called to do. We have been called into something that does not look like what culture just naturally produces. We have been called into something different, into a challenge to love others, to become one body, to unify with everybody. That's hard. And I know that we can't force anybody to know and to love God, but that's part of the beauty of what Jesus has called us into. To love God, to love others, and when they are ready, to help teach them to do the same. See, I can go rock climbing without these shoes. It's not going to be as good as if I go rock climbing with all of my gear. God is going to do amazing things in His community. He already has, and He is, and He will. But we are not going to be the full image until everybody is a part of it. Everybody has been given that chance to join this ecclesia, to join in on that calling. I'm going to close us out by reading a passage from Ephesians. This is another example of Paul's challenge, but this is going to be our prayer. We're going to pray the passage as a challenge for us. And so as we do this, I just ask that you reflect on what this challenge is. Listen to what God might be challenging us to do as an ecclesia, as a church, as a group of people who are called into something else. If you would please pray with me as I read Ephesians 4:25 through 31. Therefore, having put away falsehood, let each one of us speak the truth with our neighbors, for we are members of one another. Let us be angry and do not sin. Let us not let the sun go down on our anger, and let us give no opportunity to the devil. Let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands, so he may have something to share with anyone in need. Let no corrupting talk come out of our mouths, but only such as good for building up as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. And let us not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, by whom we are sealed for the day of redemption. And let all of our bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from us, along with all malice. Please let us be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ